Hi, everyone. I'm Assemblyman Christopher DePhillips of New Jersey's 40th Legislative District. I'm thrilled that my first podcast guest is my longtime friend and former law school classmate, Wendy Sefcik. Wendy has worn many hats over the years. In addition to being a lawyer, she is a mom, a spouse, and a highly regarded voice in New Jersey in the area of mental health policy. She has weathered some personal storms in her life, and I've been amazed by how she can always see light in the darkness and how she's been able to transition from tragedy to action on more than one occasion. I'm looking forward to her insights and expertise in how we can all weather the COVID-19 storm and all become more mentally healthy as we come out of the darkness of this statewide crisis. So Wendy, welcome, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
That's great. How are you and your family doing during this crisis?
I'm really grateful to report that we are all safe and healthy and really working at staying at home and staying safe and doing what we need to do.
That is good to hear. Wendy, if you could tell our audience how you first became involved in mental health policy and how personal circumstances and tragedy have brought you to this point.
Yes, unfortunately, I got involved with mental health advocacy and suicide prevention when I lost my 16-year-old son, TJ, to suicide on December 1st, 2010. Prior to that, I really thought that I had everything figured out, right? I was concerned about my kid's physical health. I was juggling a lot of different balls in the air. But one thing I never really thought much about was mental health. And I never dreamed that suicide would impact our family. So after I lost TJ, I really needed to find answers. I needed to know what I missed. And I was really shocked to learn how many people we lose every year to suicide. Every year in this country, we lose over 48,000 people to suicide. It's the second leading cause of death for our youth. And it's something that I never knew about. So once I learned that, I realized that maybe I couldn't bring my son back, but that I could save others by raising awareness and advocating for better mental health care and just letting people know that we need to keep our mental health on everybody's radar, and they need to take care of their mental health in the same way they take care of their physical health.
How did you initially survive this and get through this tragedy?
Many years ago, over 30 years ago, I lost my first husband in a terrorist bombing, Pan Am 103, on December 21st, 1988. And that was tragic and sudden. It was something that I didn't think I could live through, and I did. And I began advocating for airline security at that time and found in helping others there was a lot of healing. And propelling myself forward in a positive way, I found helpful. And that really did help when I lost my son, TJ. Although it was very, very different, I realized that whether I wanted to go on or not, chances were that I was going to go on. And I also am very blessed to have two other sons, and I knew that I had to find a way forward for them. I did not want their lives to be defined by their brother's death. And I didn't want my son TJ's life to be defined by his death. So I knew that I needed to find a way forward, and that's what I did.
When you first lost TJ, what support systems did you initially have around you to help you through those first several months, and how were you able to cope?
That's a great question, Chris, because I think it's important to understand that everybody has different support systems. I was very blessed because I have a really strong family unit. I have wonderful friends. My community was spectacular, the way they embraced our entire family. I live in Morris County, and we were really, really lucky in that way. And it's not the same for everybody. Historically, when people die by suicide, very often there's a lot of stigma attached to it. And rather than be embraced, people are often kind of pushed to the side and made to feel shame. So that was another reason that my family and I decided that we wanted to be really vocal and outspoken about it, because we didn't feel shame. We knew that we were a good family, that we supported our children, This was just something that was bigger than us, something we didn't understand. So we were very lucky with the support systems in place, and we were able to access counseling and grief support in addition, which is also something that unfortunately isn't equally available to everybody.
At what point were you able to say to yourself, I need to do something about mental health in my community and in our state?
Honestly, it was the day TJ died, because I immediately thought of my other two children and all of TJ's friends. And I realized that if TJ died in this way, that everyone and anyone could possibly be at risk. And TJ was a really outgoing, dynamic kid. He was a varsity athlete. He was that kid that always had smiles. He was a big personality. And I really was afraid that other kids would look at that and think that this was an option. And so immediately, even at his celebration of life, one of the things we did was we talked to the kids. And we wanted the kids to understand that suicide can never be an option, that life can and will be hard, but there are always other support systems in place and other options, even if it's sometimes hard to see them. So one of the things that I am really passionate about is finding out what the resources are locally and how we can get that information out, so that not only kids, but that adults, everyone across the lifespan, can realize that when they're struggling and when life seems so hopeless that death is the only answer, that there are support systems that are easy for them to see and connect to.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that answer. Wendy, can you tell our audience some of the things you are doing, not only to preserve TJ's memory, but also to shine a light on mental illness, specifically how it can be identified and how it can be treated? Because as you all know, it is so difficult sometimes to pinpoint and identify mental illness in particularly a young person.
I currently serve on the New Jersey board for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And one of the AFSP's big push is have a real conversation, because the most important thing any of us can do is to simply notice. Notice any type of behavior in somebody that we care about, a coworker, a family member, friend, anybody. If there's a change in behavior that goes on for a period of time. So everyone's going to have a bad day once in a while. But if there's a change in behavior, maybe the sleep habits have changed, maybe someone that always came into work on time is coming in late, maybe your kid is oversleeping all the time, isn't eating the same, seems particularly irritable. These are things to notice and to just start a conversation about, because mental health issues are very, very common. The vast majority of us will know someone or will ourselves struggle with a mental health disorder at some time in our lives. I think the current figures are 1 in 4 of us will struggle at one point. That doesn't mean that those people will go on to die by suicide. Thankfully, the vast majority of people who struggle with mental health issues will not go on to die by suicide. But many people who die by suicide do have a mental health condition contributing at the time of their death that may or not have been recognized by even themselves, because we don't talk enough about mental health issues. So people don't realize that, hey, maybe I need to get some help.
Can you describe for our audience what you were doing on a daily basis before the pandemic hit to advance the cause of mental health, and specifically suicide risk assessment and prevention, which, as you know, is a very complicated issue?
I am completely immersed in this area. As you mentioned earlier, I am not a mental health clinician. By education, I'm a lawyer, so research comes very natural to me. So I really dove into learning whatever I could, and I currently serve as chair for the New Jersey Youth Suicide Prevention Advisory Council. As I mentioned, I'm the chair of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and I'm also on staff with Bergen County as their suicide prevention coordinator under the Division of Mental Health. And just recently was appointed to serve on Governor Murphy's mental health working group that has just been formed. We have our first meeting tomorrow to see what else we can do for the schools, what more we can do for mental health and suicide prevention. And this was put in place prior to COVID. So what I do on an everyday basis is I'm out there in the field, in communities, training, doing programs. The trainings I do is called Talk Saves Lives. It's an American Foundation for Suicide Prevention program. And that's really what it's about. It helps people to identify risk factors and warning signs for suicide, what each of us can do to identify and recognize, start conversations, and connect people to help. So on a daily basis, I'm educating myself. I'm reaching out to people every day, providing a lot of support for those who have survived a suicide loss, because we know anyone who's been touched by suicide is at greater risk for suicide. So it's really important that we connect those people to resources as well and make them feel not so isolated and let them know that they're understood. So every day I'm doing whatever I can to make sure that people are connected, understand the importance of taking care of their mental health, and knowing what the resources are in their communities.
What do you expect will come out of the task force group that Governor Murphy appointed you to?
Well, what I'm hoping is that the working group will not, they or have already identified that our kids' mental health is in trouble. And we need to do more to support their mental health in schools. So I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to identify different curriculums and programs that we can provide to the schools so that they can choose what works best for their district. One of the things I believe is that it's not one size fits all. Every district has different needs and demographics, and we need to understand that and consider that when we're selecting programs and what more we can do. I also think that there will be a lot of attention paid to social and emotional learning. The Department of Education has made a big push that we need to get back to basics with our kids from the time they entered our schools in kindergarten, really in preschool, and we need to start paying attention to their social and emotional learning, because children who are mentally strong will flourish much more academically. And there's been, such a strong push. We have, we're very blessed here in New Jersey. We have great schools. But one of the things we need to do is we need to get back to taking care of people's mental health, because the rate of suicide for our youth is going up. So I think that's going to be something that the working group is going to be paying attention to, how best we can support our schools, not dictate what they need to do, but how can we support the schools and what resources can we provide them with that already exists. There's a lot of good stuff out there. We just have to make it easier to find.
Now turning to the pandemic, what are some of the mental health challenges you're seeing specifically with regard to the coronavirus crisis?
Well, we know in the area of mental health, one of the most important things that we can do is foster connection. And just by virtue of the nature of this pandemic, there's a lot of distancing. So one of the things that we like to enforce is social distancing doesn't mean disconnecting. So we have to make efforts to connect with people within our lives. It's really, really important. Make those phone calls, send those texts, set up Zoom meetings and other similar types of meetings on those platforms so you can connect with people. And also there's the issue of deaths of despair. We know with something like this that happens, a lot of people are losing their jobs, their finances are in trouble. So deaths of despair it's a class of behavior-related medical conditions that increase in groups of people who are experiencing despair due to a sense that their long-term social and economic outlook may be bleak. And we have 3 disease types that fall into this that all deal with mental health as well, which would be drug overdoses, suicide, and alcoholic liver disease. So we do know that when people are struggling emotionally, very often they'll turn to substances. And that's why it's all part of the same picture. Prior to COVID, we were looking a lot at the rate of drug overdoses and what we could do there. And we realized that we need to once again come back to that mental health piece. So unfortunately, we are very, very concerned about what's going to happen to the rates of suicide. as the days, weeks, and months continue on, and knowing what an economic impact that this pandemic is going to have. We do expect the rates to rise, but I do think that expectation also is really just a wake-up call that we need to be proactive in getting the word about the importance of mental health care out there, and self-care, which is something that we can all be proactive about.
Have you had access to data yet regarding mental health impacts, but specifically suicides, regarding people who've either been forced into unemployment or people who've been mentally suffering because they've been isolated in their homes now for more than 2 months? I'm just interested if there's any data yet on suicide statistics.
No, what the data that we're looking at actually is data from past. Obviously, we've never had this exact issue, this pandemic, but we have had other things, tragedies that have happened. Even things looking at like after Superstorm Sandy, the way that impacted New Jersey. So there were some, the financial considerations, people being disconnected. So we're looking at that data. The current data, there's not much out there yet that we really can base much on, but we are looking at past data, and as the data comes in, we'll be following it. But I don't have much to really report as far as current data on that.
Okay.
I can tell you that we did see in the state with regard to youth suicide, we were really off to a horrific start in the first 2 months of the year. We were really concerned about our rates of youth suicide. We really were losing a lot of kids. And what that seems to have stopped. It's not that we haven't lost any youth since the pandemic began, but the rate seemed to stop. And we think, again, we don't know exactly why, but kids are home. They're with their families. So for those groups, there is that sense of connection, which is really important. And, we're hoping that trend will continue after, but we really have no way of knowing, what will happen with that.
Well, speaking of kids, what about children and the impact on them? Because they've been removed from socialization, they're away from their schools, away from their teachers, their coaches, and their friends. What do you think the mental health impacts are on those children? And of course, obviously each case is different, but are you seeing any trends?
Each case is different, and there really isn't an easy answer to that. But I can tell you the impact hasn't all been negative. A lot of kids were feeling increasingly stressed, lots of reports of anxiety and record numbers. Kids put a lot of pressure on themselves. And we live in New Jersey. We live in an area where we have a lot of high achieving kids. And they were feeling a lot of pressure. So one of the things that we've heard from kids, because we've been trying to poll kids in different districts, is, this has kind of been a time out for them, and they have been forced to take some time that they never in their lives have had. Their lives tend to be very, very structured, reporting hours of homework in addition to sports and other activities, and they don't have that. So that's one of the positives. We're hearing, people are sitting down, they're having dinner together as a family. They're playing games and doing things together, going out for walks as a family, which isn't something that happened a lot. Now that's just, one set, and that's the positives. But on the negatives, yes, there is that sense of isolation. Kids, at least today, are fortunate in that many kids are able to be connected via technology, and I know they're doing that. But we're really going to have to live and see. I know some of the kids that are particularly struggling are kids that were struggling prior to COVID. It's been even more difficult for them because a lot of the resources that they had, kids that were in counseling and were getting help, now have to do that virtually. And for a lot of these kids, it's not, the connection factor isn't as positive. For some, it is. It's okay to do it virtually, but some kids really get more benefit of being able to be with their clinician. So we're seeing kind of a mixed bag with that. It's, there's a big spectrum.
Well, you actually predicted my next question, which was, for people who are locked up in their homes, whether kids or adults, and already have pre-existing anxiety and or depression, what does this crisis do to them in terms of aggravating those conditions?
I think it's, again, it can go either way, because for sometimes some of these kids that are really struggling, for example, a kid who just was struggling to the point that they couldn't go to school anymore. One of the things we're hearing from those kids is they almost feel calmer because they don't feel like they're missing out because their peers are also home now. But other kids are really, really feeling increasingly anxious because this is such a scary time. So there's a lot more to feel anxious about. There's, historically, when kids or people struggle with anxiety, it's because they can't turn their brains off and they're worrying about a lot of things that we don't know. And this pandemic certainly has presented all of us with the challenge of the unknown. It's an enemy that we can't see. It's an enemy that's very difficult to fight. And there's so much unknown, so that people who are struggling prior to COVID, many are seeing their anxiety and even their depression, their sense of hopelessness is increasing, which is definitely a concern. But the good thing is there are resources out there for people to access, and we just have to make sure that they know. We have crisis text line, the National Suicide Prevention Helpline, and also we have helplines that are really just for anybody who's having challenges with their mental health. We have some call-in lines that people can call and access to have conversations with trained listeners to help them navigate.
Let's turn for a minute to our heroic frontline healthcare workers, who've literally been on the front line of the battle against the virus. Do you think they have the capacity to experience PTSD, and are they at an increased risk for suicide since they've literally seen the horrors of the COVID-19 war up front and close?
Absolutely. It's a big concern. I think, many people don't realize that even prior to COVID, our physicians are at an increased risk for suicide than the general population, because what they are doing every single day, they're the helpers, they're the caretakers, they take a lot on their shoulders naturally, and that has only been exacerbated during COVID. They are sleep deprived, they are short staffed, they are, as I said, dealing with this invisible enemy. They're worried for themselves, they're worried for their families, and they are literally putting their lives on the line every day to help others. So we absolutely can expect to see disorders like PTSD in our frontline workers, and we have to make sure that we continue to support them. I've been very heartened by so much publicity and really community outpouring supporting our frontline workers. And one of my hopes for post-pandemic is that we remember who our true heroes are. And our frontline workers are not only the heroes during this pandemic, they are the invisible heroes every day. They're saving lives 365 days a year, 24/7, whether we're in a pandemic or not. And I hope that that's one of the things that we remember is we need to pay tribute to these people and let them know that they're recognized. And I think that will help. But we do need to continue to support them and connect them. And I know that that's something that in the mental health field, really we're very, very cognizant of, and different resources are popping up every day. Literally, grants are providing funding so that we can support our frontline workers.
What specifically, in terms of resources or helplines or support groups, would you recommend to those frontline healthcare workers who are experiencing anxiety and other conditions related to the COVID war, especially when they're, like you said, working around the clock, they're 24/7, they're on the front lines of this battle, doing all of this heroic work for us? Do they even have time to attend to these issues at this point in time? And will these conditions or these risks really hit them afterwards?
Well, and it is unfortunate that time, right? Time is it's a gift and it's a curse. So right now, I'm sure that many of our frontline workers feel I don't have time to take care of myself. And literally they probably don't. But I think it's critical that they carve out moments each day to take care of their mental health. There's a lot that can be done in the area of mindfulness to calm one's self down that can be done in pockets, literally seconds and minutes. And that's something that we need to really enforce, you know, on our frontline workers. And I think that can be done from the top down. So in these hospitals, and I do know that a lot of them are paying attention and realize that, and they are providing that access, whether it's a quiet room, just a place that they can go to, that they can literally take a few minutes. And then there are helplines that are specific to healthcare workers that are dealing with COVID that they can call. And I would hope that they would take advantage of that. There are also some podcasts and other resources like that are happening, that they can know that they're not alone in what they're feeling, that there are other frontline workers that are going through the same things. And I think we really do need to do a better job of identifying those. And I know that's one of the things that you're doing in your office, which I really, really admire, because you're making an effort to make sure that you post these resources. Social media can be a curse and a gift, and it can be a gift because we can get these resources out to a large amount of people. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen your office doing, and I really admire.
No, I appreciate that. I wanted to ask you a question about suicide risk assessment, because you certainly know from personal experience how tricky that can be. And it's sometimes an invisible risk right in front of you or anyone who has suffered suicide in their family. What advice or guidance during the pandemic would you give to those clinicians, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, who we all assume have the requisite training in suicide risk assessment and prevention, but oftentimes do not? What would you tell them in the middle of this pandemic?
Well, this is a good opportunity to get training. And I think this is another area where I really have to take my hat off to you, because you are, co-sponsoring a bill that will require that our clinicians have training in suicide or risk assessment and treatment, which is something that I think lay people would imagine is something that, of course, already happens. And I know that's one of the things I was shocked to learn, that in order to be a licensed clinician, you don't have to have specific training in suicide risk assessment and treatment. And that's the end game, right? People are dying. So I think that every single clinician needs training, really, really important. And I think even if it isn't legislated, that every clinician really should make an effort to get trained so that they're comfortable having conversations. And even taking it outside of clinicians, we can all do the work of suicide prevention simply by having conversations. I think it's really important that people understand that talking about suicide will not plant a seed and make somebody think about suicide and go on to die by suicide. One of the greatest myths in suicide work is that by talking about it, you plant a seed. So I encourage everybody to have conversations about mental health, especially during this time. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, and say, how are you doing really? And be prepared to listen. I think one of the things that we throw out often is, how are you? But we're really already moving on to the next question. We don't want to really know. So it's to take that pause, to become more effective listeners, and to really hear how people are, and to not be afraid to talk about suicide. Look, you don't seem like yourself. You seem like you're really struggling. I noticed that you're not eating. I noticed that you're really irritable. I noticed that you were in your room crying last night. Sometimes when people are feeling like that, they also think about suicide. Have you ever thought about suicide? Have you ever thought of killing yourself? So I know this sounds really counter to what people might think they should do, but we know that having these conversations calmly, honestly, without judgment, and really being open to listening and letting somebody talk about how they're feeling tend to be really, really helpful. And it's really, really important that we all do this. And the same thing with clinicians. Many clinicians are not having these conversations, and it's critical that every single clinician have conversations with their patients, if depending, of course, upon the reason that that person is coming to see them.
Well, I agree with you 100% on that. So I just have a couple more questions for you. One involves the state of New Jersey. What do you think the state should be doing better in terms of mental health policy during the pandemic, specifically in terms of funding for telehealth or programs geared towards substance abuse prevention or domestic and child abuse prevention? Do you have any suggestions for people like myself, who's a state legislator, specifically around the funding?
I think one of the most important things that you can do is to keep an eye out and an ear out for the funding opportunities that are out there. SAMHSA just came out with a new funding opportunity for exactly this. So we need to be aware of what funding opportunities are out there, and we need to know who we can direct to go after those grants to get the money into the state. There's a lot of federal money out there. So I think that's something that we can do, something we can look out for, and to start to identify what the gaps are. That's one of the things I'm hoping is going to come out of this working group, but that will just target youth. So I'd like to see some kind of working group that can identify the gaps for mental health treatment with adults, and that will take us through the lifespan. We want to look at people like our seniors that are particularly isolated, many of them during this time. What are we doing for them? What is the mental health available to them? So I think, from the legislative side, it's to look and to understand what's out there. I think it's also very important that legislators have an understanding of what is already out there. One of the things that I've noticed is sometimes we have laws on the books and they get signed and then they get forgotten about. And then we don't want to reinvent the wheel. And this is not something only for legislators. This is been one of my priorities as chair of the New Jersey Youth Suicide Prevention Advisory Council. I think we have to stop working in silos in this state. And not only this state, I'm sure this happens nationally as well, but talking about New Jersey specifically, we have a lot of resources. We need to figure out what they are. We need to do a better job of collaborating, of working together, and not reinventing the wheel.
So final question, where do you think we go from here? And what advice do you have for all of us to stay mentally healthy, even after we've gotten through the pandemic?
Well, where do we go from here? The only way is forward. So like it or not, we have to take it one day at a time, and we have to move forward, I think, as mindfully as we possibly can. And what that means is to not look too far into the future, but to see where we are today and what we can do. And I think we all need to be responsible as the state starts to open up, and to remember what we have lived through and to learn the lessons of that, and to understand that there have been gifts in this pandemic that we can take forward. I think one of the things it's going to really put a spotlight on things that we're grateful for. I think we've always talked in this country about the idea of freedom, but I think we really will have a different definition of what freedom means after this pandemic, and what it means to walk around freely and to walk into places, to get to see our family and our loved ones when that's been so restricted. So I think moving forward, we have to remember what we've lived through and what we've learned, what really matters, the big difference between what we want and what we need. I think something many of us have learned is there's a big difference. There's a lot of things that we thought we couldn't live without and we really don't need. So we have to take those lessons with us moving forward. And I think at the end of the day, the most important thing that we need to do moving forward is to hold on to that kindness, the idea of connection and supporting each other. And if we do that, we're going to make a big dent in supporting mental health and keeping our mental health where it needs to be so that we can function properly and support those around us.
That is great advice. Wendy, thank you so much for your time and the gift of your insights. Thank you again for joining me today. And please stay in touch with me. I'd love to hear how Governor Murphy's working group is going, and if you have any recommendations for me or other legislators coming out of that working group. So stay in touch. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.